So this is for my friend Damien. I'm going to explain to him a little bit about lettering, because he is lettering my new comic, I Am Become Pestilence, and he's having a bit of a hard time with it. So in order to help put some of his fears to rest about the project, I'm going to go through what I think is a very good example of lettering in comics and help him learn a little. So, dear Damien, Brian Michael Bendis writes a bajillion words per panel. He writes entire paragraphs in every single panel, and being a letterer on one of his books would probably be a fucking nightmare. So, let's go through a couple of pages written by Bendis and see what works about the lettering, because it may not always look like there's enough space in every single panel for what needs to be said or what needs to be done. But a good letterist, letterer, letterman, a good old letter boy always finds a way. So what I'm noticing here is that already this letterer, he did this very, simple trick of just pacing it out basically sentence by sentence, or at least, grouping together two here. But he put it in this pattern so that it kind of arcs around the art. So you start out here up in this negative space where there's really nothing, and it kind of curves around Peter's foot and follows back to his face. It almost tells you a little bit of a story. It's almost like a slow pan, but visual, where you start up here looking at nothing, and then your eye follows the art all the way down here to his face, the emotional focal point center of this panel. There's a lot of emotion there. So we start with his thoughts. It's almost like imagining a camera in a movie starting aimed at a wall and then slowly panning over to the face of the character as he's monologuing. Obviously here, this is a panel. They gave a lot of space for all of this. It's just giving a little bit of text for every single bubble. And, the thing about the bubbles is that they don't often ever really touch the edges, even on this one. It would be really easy to have that one be touching the edge. Captions, I think, usually the general rule for them is that they always stay kind of floating in the middle, because captions are meant to convey a voice, an inner voice. So I think it's important that as few times as possible they don't actually touch the edges of the art, because that it just kind of solidifies them. It almost makes them seem less like they're floating on top of the situation and more attached to it physically. While as with dialogue, I think the reason that's able to touch the borders is because the dialogue is being spoken out loud. It's more of a physical part of the scene. It can be heard, it can be felt. The dialogue is a sound less than a abstract thought. Now here you might see all of this. Like if I were to type all of this out, you would see it as just this brick of text on the script, and it would say, panel 1, 2, 3, 4. It would say panel 4 and have all this text, and you'd look at this and you go, where the fuck do I put this? Would I shove all of it up here in one single box? Oh, let's go check what that is. Oh, look, that's you, Damien. Do you see that? That's you in the past. Anyway, you'd look at all this and think, which part do I shove all of it in? But you just break it up and then just kind of follow along lines of the art. It's always kind of following curves. I think I can actually draw in this program I'm recording. So, yeah, look. You follow the curves, you find the dead space, and then kind of draw inside of there. It's a handy trick, So let's move on to another page. All right, so this one. I picked this one because I like the way it does the thought captions. Now, for this one, it's supposed to be kind of panicked and scared and frightened. His thoughts are a little bit scattered. So they're literally scattered in several boxes. They're quick little snippets of information. This can't be spinning, can't see straight. Like all of this is put into tiny little boxes because they're all tiny little thoughts zooming by in his head all at once. They're, kind of just quick little moments. It's not a giant single thought. It's not one big box over off to the side here with all of this stuck inside of it, because then it would look kind of cheesy and weird. But, you know, the stylization of it here, all of this, the way it's broken up, helps it to feel a little bit more important, and it just kind of, it helps with the panic of the situation, because he's been shot and he's running away from the cops, you know? Okay, so dialogue. Two people talking. I like this example because it's a very small little scene. Everyone's, you know, they're not giving each other a giant speech. It's just a little bit of a, you know, he says one thing, he says another. Very short sentences. And, you know, really the thing about it is that I notice if it's possible to make the word bubble round, they always go for it. You can't quite make it a perfect circle around just the word "and," but if you have just a couple of words, usually it's pretty round. They don't have very... you don't often see very, you know, like this bubble. It's very oval shaped and elongated and horizontal. That's because it's clustered around a single word that's a little bit longer than, you know, like 3 letters up here. So that's why this one's shaped this way. But a sentence that has about 4 words is still almost a perfect circle. He stacks them in a way that just, you know, gets it as rounded as possible. It's not kind of elongated horizontally. You try to avoid that as much as possible, because the elongated horizontal word bubbles they just tend to look kind of off. You know, it's just kind of the rule that you don't go for them as much as you can. Sure, you might see them here and there, but it's still, you know, you tend to try to avoid them. Now, here is just an example of, like, stylization to help the scene work. Is just making you could write this as just plain text, but it makes it so much more impactful to have it kind of blasting out of the bubble like this. Like, I see this all the time where they shape around the letter as it kind of explodes out of the, you know, the exterior of it. But then as her laughter and the way she's talking calms down, it sort of chills out here and is a little bit more, you know, rounded out standard word bubble. So you just consider that for when, you know, someone's yelling or something crazy is happening, or you want to really emphasize something being said. Now, here is another example of captioning in a very clustered, big, crazy scene. Like, you notice how there's probably a ton of stuff behind this little word bubble, or this caption box here. Unfortunately, we don't get to see what a lot of that is, but the thing is, it doesn't matter. It's just background stuff, you know. These people, they don't matter. Their lives are small. They're boring people. They don't matter. This is Spider-Man. He's a god among men. Look at this man. This man has seen death. He's killed people. On accident, but still he's done it. This man, he's gone to other worlds. Look at him shoving that candy bar in his mouth like nothing's ever happened. This man, there's an alien that lived on his skin. He met God. He had an actual conversation with God. He had lunch with him once. He yelled at him a lot. These are the eyes of a man who doesn't have a wife anymore because of Satan. Anyway, all this stuff back here, all these other people, they don't really matter, so you just kind of, you know, for background characters, you can just kind of put word boxes and letters and all that over them, because it doesn't matter. And up here, I like this really creative use of this space, because he has, what is this, like 3 sentences to say, and instead of trying to put it in this big block of text right up here over, you know, a whole chunk of her face, he just paces it out and strings it along the top, so you just kind of follow it along. You know, there's a very creative use of the dead space, because if you look at your focal point, you know, there's this thing where he's thinking about what this chick says, so she's kind of running through his mind, literally. Instead of putting any of the word bubbles over her, because she is a focal point, basically this is all just like, everything through here is like a dead zone that you can't necessarily put art in. Maybe in here if you could get away with it, So he goes for the method of trying to put it more up top. Also over here, since there's a little bit bigger of a gap between her and herself, and also you don't get to see the face of this one, so it's not really a focal point. You know, it's just trying to figure out the best spots to put it the way it doesn't cover over the main focus of the image. Because the thing is you gotta remember that not every single part of your art is going to be necessary. You have to look for what is the most important thing and focus on that. Peter is the most important thing in these panels. Also, this chick looking back at him, maybe that has some kind of significance to the story. You know, there's also Jameson back here. You just find the space that isn't one of these people. And yes, it kind of covers over his shoulder, and, you know, it's not over here, so he's looking at the word bubble. So you have to take into account little things like that, so it doesn't look like either of them are looking at a word bubble. So they put it over here, over on his shoulder. It's just being as creative and thoughtful as you possibly can about the placement. Okay, now, this one. This spot I want to highlight down here. I really like this little chunk here because this is a lot of dialogue for a panel that gives you no fucking space. If you looked at the script for this and saw this amount of dialogue and then saw this panel, I'm sure you'd, like, lose your shit. It would be so frustrating. But they came up with a method to do it anyway because, like I said, there is always a way. You know, don't ever give up and go, there's no room. There's always room. So without even really intruding too badly on the art of this panel, because you still see these people all on the ground, all smoking, all messed up and beat up from the fight, you still see that the focal point of them is still there, as well as them fighting in the back. They hooked all of the dialogue along this little border here, because the border isn't important, you know? It's empty space. You don't put it in the margins, because then that'll just make it impossible to print. But you can kind of cheat it along the little top of the box here. You know, it's creative placement. Okay, this one I thought was an interesting panel because he has a lot to say and not a lot of room to say it. So the letterer for this issue kind of curved his speech around his head in a way that, you know, because you're always reading these word bubbles left to right, and usually they traditionally they kind of go down, you know. That's how you read comics, is you read them left to right and down. So they treated the word bubbles the same way. You read it left to right and down. The first one goes up here, second one goes down here. Another indication of the placement is that this one's lower than this one. They did the same exact thing. So your eye is tracing it along all the way to here, almost the same way that we were talking about that speech at that first page we showed, is the way it kind of pans down to his face. It starts at this empty spot up here, and then creatively just kind of takes you right back to the focal point. Because I think Bagley, I don't know if he necessarily intended for it to be lettered this way, but he did leave a little bit of space up here along Electro's head. It's not dead center of the panel, so I think he either intended for maybe the word bubbles to be along here or something, but I like the way it was done in that it follows down this way, because it tracks your eye. It's you know, basic it's basic art tricks, really, is you got to lead the eye of the person that's reading it. Same way as, you know, like graphic design, you got to make sure that the focal point of your image is easy to figure out. You track your audience there. And even here, they do the same sort of stuff. There's a lot of dialogue per panel, but you figure it out. I picked this one because I noticed that this guy, he throws in his little piece for the conversation here, and it actually cuts off the top of Flash Thompson's head. But, you know, you can still see Flash Thompson's face. His emotion is still prevalent. The conversation is not being disrupted because there's not a big crazy word bubble on his face. You don't really notice that it's on top of his hair because, you know, his hair isn't like the most important thing in the world. You should always, something they tell you in film school is to always edit based on emotion. Cut on emotion first and continuity second. So sometimes, you know, like if you cut from one shot to the next and the person's sitting in a slightly different way, but it was both, you know, the best takes. It cuts from best take of this line to the best take of that line. You don't cut to a worse take just because he was sitting the same way in both of them. You use the best ones the way the actor was acting. You're editing around the performance. So it's kind of a similar rule, is that, you know, sometimes you have to cut, you have to do these letters not based on what's going to preserve the art the best, but what's going to preserve the emotion the best. Now, everyone's face is important to keep as open as possible. You know, when he's talking, you need to see his face. You need to see his emotions. You know, he looks a little concerned, and she looks a little, you know, kind of, I don't know if I want to answer that question, right? And it's okay if his head is a little cut off up here. You don't make a habit of it, but it's not the biggest problem. I noticed with here, this could easily be one big word bubble, but they kind of split it up just to accentuate what he's saying. Sometimes you have to really, really pay attention to what's being said in the dialogue itself and think about the way to letter it rhythmically, so that it kind of emphasizes the beats of the sentence. Because he's going, hey, you ever think, like, what if in Ghostbusters, like there's this pause when he's kind of enunciating that he has this idea, he's trying to get their attention, then it leads into this bigger point. You know, it's just a little subtle trick that I like that they use there. And, you know, of course, there's a lot of dialogue for this panel, but he still finds a way to get it all in and still figures out a way to curve it. There's a lot of question mark shaped lettering in this series, and it's done by all different letterers. I'm not telling you to emulate one single person. I actually checked, and that's why there's different type of thought bubbles here versus here, is because the different letterers, because they're several issues apart. So, you know, you got to look for tricks wherever you can. And then, of course, you know, there's stuff like this. There's a lot of empty space up above MJ's head, and they just, you know, kind of rhythmically flow through one little piece to the next so that you get all this dialogue in here. This is a good spot. And, you know, this really makes the scream really, you know, loud. It looks visually loud. Stylize this stuff. But this one's these are smaller noises. It's not quite, you know, the same impact and emphasis as this panel, so they're slightly taken back. It's just, you know, again, context based. Think about the art and the script and how this would sound out loud. Here, I really like the way they did this, because look at this panel, right? It has enough headroom for a little bit of lettering, but I believe this is I think it's Mary Parker, yeah. Richard Parker's wife has a giant speech to give in just this panel, right? The script, I'm sure, says panel is a very complicated layout, but look at all that. Could you imagine if I wrote a script to you and then sent it, and I told you to fit all of that in just this tiny box? It's impossible, but there's still a way to do it. So I like the way this one, the way it bleeds across from this panel all the way down to this one. You start with what he's saying, and then as she goes into her whole speech, it kind of, you know, tracks your eye from this panel down to this one. It also helps with the layout, because, you know, some people might have a hard time figuring out where to go next from one art piece to the next, or, you know, from one panel to the next. So, you know, lettering can help trace you along the page. It kind of helps you follow. And her whole speech is given here almost like it's, you know, being said off screen, and then you cut to this part. And, you know, it's actually interesting that you don't ever actually see her face, considering what she's saying is so important. So, you know, just pay attention for stuff like that. If someone has a lot to say, look for any empty space you can use. Any at all. Even if it's bleeding into another panel, if it can be used in a sort of sense for flow, you get this panel to lead to this one, go for it. His shoulder is not a very important part of the image, much like his eyes meeting his. This is still preserved because these are the two focal points. His shoulder is not a focal point. You can cut that off, so that's fine. This one I picked to look at just because it's, just very good use of all the negative space you can find. Follow all the way down to here. You track towards their face. Don't cover other people's faces. What is going on with MJ's eye? She looks like the devil. Holy shit, she's possessed by a demon. What the fuck? But anyway, you just find whatever space you can. There's plenty up here. You don't need to see this brick wall. Granted, I'm sure the color person, or, maybe Bagley, they put a lot of work into making sure that brick wall was textured and looks really nice. But it's not important. She's important. Gwen is important. Maybe she's a little bit of a pain in the neck sometimes, but you got to make sure that what she's saying is the focus. So, you just cover up this. There's really creative placement because I think all of this text is wherever you can find space for it, and there's times where you just follow the curvature of the art. It's a really handy trick, and you can just make it look so pretty by doing that. Now, this is a very major thing, and I don't know if you know this rule, but when you have a paragraph of dialogue, always, 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 in any way you can, make it round. Even though that's what's important about center aligning the text, is that you can have it curve. Let's show you here. So, the text, there's only one there's only one word on this bottom line. You could probably fit two, but the placement of it was put in such a way that it fits in a little circle. You can you place the text down first as circle-shaped little blocks of text, then put the bubbles behind them second. The bubbles come second, the text goes first. That's why you have to kind of make it easy on yourself. You make the text shaped like a circle as best you can first. Sometimes it's harder. Sometimes you may have to get this sort of elliptical, elongated bubble. Like I said, it's something you should try to avoid, but for this panel, it seemed to be the best way to fit all of that in here without making it go up off into the margin or cutting off her head. So it was just the way that he had to use the space. So just think about that kind of stuff. Keep it as round as possible. And yeah, I also like how it tracks, it follows along, because we get this really important, super emphasized panel, and then already we're being tracked along to the next important thing. And it's about leading the eye. You're kind of the tracks on the train when it comes to comics. You're doing your best you can to accentuate the art. It should never look out of place. And I like this is a good use of space considering what's available. An amateur letterer would probably try and put it in the middle because that's where they're talking, right? She's talking to him, he's talking to her. I like the way it was done here, where there's empty space behind his head. There's a whole chunk of this panel that's not being used. Just put it there. There's a very good arch on her back, so you could just kind of trace that line and follow down her back, because there's this whole column of nothing over here. So this entire conversation gets fitted in here. Some would try and put it along the bottom like this, but I think this is a good use of the empty space. You're always trying to figure out what's the best use of your negative space, as well as sometimes when it's necessary to have the art cut something off. This is a giant, annoying, huge conversation. Like, look at all this. There's so much being said on this page. I picked this one because 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 panels. My layouts, I usually try to keep them like 6 panels max, because like this is a nightmare to draw. especially also to letter. But when you have a time constraint, you have to get a certain amount of information about in only 22 pages. You may have to do a layout like this, where maybe you combine 2 pages of 4 or 5 pages into, or 4 or 5 panels into one gigantic thing. So I understand the decision to do that here. So this is a big conversation. I noticed that in order to get this whole little chunk of text, it was placed on the back of her head. But the front of her face, which is, the spot where he's looking, the important part, is still left empty. And this is negative space here, but it's not quite negative space where it would fit. He'd be staring at her word bubble, she'd be staring at nothing. This sort of ominous, cool look of mysteriousness she's doing, where they're eyeing each other down and, she's all shadowy. That would be kind of lost if you put it here. So while there is negative space, it's not quite appropriate negative space. So it's understandable why it would be on the back of her head. And again, not in the margin. Never, never in the margin. Nowhere. Avoid this. There's also creative space of creative placement of just following along through here. Track all the way back to his mouth, and it's cool because it manages to show this other character in the scene while also still having your eye track through this. So even though you may not look at it that way if it had the word bubbles gone, if you just took this base art, you'd probably only be looking at him, but it tracks your eye, so you end up seeing the background, her, him, and her, all because the lettering. It's almost like the lettering is the movement of the camera in a movie, while as the art is the set building and the actors. I try to relate it back to filmmaking as much as possible because that's what I know. I like this little spot here. It's just a nice stylization to tell you that this is a staticky noise. This is not super clear. There's not a ton of clarity. It's not super clear that this is you could tell this is coming from a TV just because of the stylization. I like this little bit of continuity on the bubbles where it doesn't break them across his whole speech. It actually has the bubble tails going to his mouth twice to give the impression that he is going through this whole speech, and you kind of see it in your head the way he moves from this position to this one while still talking the whole time. Isn't it weird how Richard Parker is drawn like 616 Peter Parker? I think that's a cool little detail that Bagley did because his Peter Parker is like really unique. Doesn't look much like him. That looks a lot like 616 Peter Parker. That's a cool little detail. His dad is old Spider-Man, whatever. Stupid. Don't need that. There's little stylization, sort of sound effects. I don't usually write a ton of sound effects into my comics because I feel like it's a little cheesy. You don't need them that much. The art can really speak for itself a lot of the time, and if you read like Punisher Max, there isn't a single sound effect little addition at any point in the whole series, but you still get a very strong feeling of what the art is saying and what noises you should be hearing just because it's so well stated in the art. Maybe if you saw this, you wouldn't exactly see, because the bed is a very small portion of this. So you just see her jumping. Maybe it looks like she's jumping onto the bed or something. So the squeak gives you this impression that she's jumped twice. I don't know if that was something Bendis intended or if something the letterer put there, but it helps to give a little extra context and make things make sense. I understand why someone would do it. Again, there's, shitload of text, but you still manage to get all of it on there. And, I just, same as always, just like look through pages of professional stuff and figure out what you can learn from them. I noticed here on this page that because there's so much he needs to say in this very vertical column, that it would be hard to kind of track it along the side here. So they kind of go for, putting it up above him and below him, you don't actually see what his hands are doing here. And the thing is really, is it super important? Because they're probably just kind of clasped together or sitting in his lap or something, you know? You don't really need to see what his hands are doing. So it's okay to cover up certain things like that, just as long as the focus of the image is because his face, you know, he's tired, he's depressed, his clothes are wrinkly, he's in this empty, dimly lit room. But you still get enough of that to understand the context in the scene and what he's feeling and what he's saying. What he's doing with his hands down here isn't necessarily the most important thing in the world. So sometimes you can cover the art in a pretty significant amount like that, because maybe half of him plus whatever is going on down here is cut off. So, you know, sometimes you have to wonder, is it super important? What is the focal point? Because it may not be his entire body on the figure, but just whatever's the most emotional part. If someone's punching, you accentuate their fist. If someone's talking, you look at their face. You always look at whatever is, you know, most important for the emotion. So his hands are not some kind of important thing in the scene. You know, there's not something in them that the audience needs to see. You don't need to see it. You just cover it up. Word bubbles. Who gives a shit, right? It works. And that brings us back to here. I really hope that this helped in some way. Tell me if this is, you know, in any way like something helpful or educational. I just thought I'd do this since, you know, lettering is in a way kind of an art form in and of itself, and people don't really give it that amount of credit. So I thought I would do this to just help learn some of the tricks of the trade, because you get a bajillion videos all over YouTube about how to make a word bubble in Photoshop, or like what the most efficient way to do that is, or you know, how to draw a certain type of scene, or you know, how to color something. But when it comes to lettering, it's kind of scarce. You don't get anything about the artistic side of lettering, because it is an art. It's something you can very easily screw up and ruin a comic if it doesn't look right. So just look at it as seriously as you would any other piece of the process. It's really almost the thing that ties it all together, is because you have to make sure that every single word that your writer put down makes it into that page. You can't edit down. You can't go, well, there's too many words in that sentence, so I'm going to cut it down. I'm going to take out, like, you don't cut out the word entire. You don't say, the world hates me, right, because some idiot was running around. You don't cut this down to fit. You put all of it in there, no matter how hard it may seem. There is always a way. That's the biggest rule of lettering. And while I may not exactly be an expert, I think I've, you know, been looking through enough comics. I've read enough comics in my life that I think I can get a pretty good feel for just how to do at least some of that stuff, you know? So let me know if this was helpful, and maybe I should send something else for something else, you know, like this. It could be fun. Thank you. Bye now.